On the eve before dawn would carry him to the gallows, the outlaw known to the territory as Jonah Crow was given one final mercy, a night alone in the narrow wooden cell beneath the hanging beam, where the wind moved through the ropes above like a slow, restless breath, and it was there, with only the lantern's weak glow and the long hours pressing close, that the man behind the legend finally began to speak, not aloud at first, but inwardly, as if confessing to the walls, to the floor worn smooth by boots and regret, to the unseen witnesses of time itself, because no one had ever asked who he was before the blood-dark stories, before the bounty posters and whispered warnings, before his name became something mothers used to quiet their children, and Jonah understood now, with a calm that surprised him, that what haunted him most was not the end coming at sunrise but the truth that would end with him if he did not let it live somewhere beyond his chest. He had been born Jonah Hale, not Crow, to a woman who sang while she worked and a father whose hands smelled of iron and earth, in a valley where the mornings were pale and kind, and he remembered thinking, once, that the world would always feel that wide and gentle, but the West had a way of sharpening itself against men, of teaching them that land could be taken, promises bent, and justice shaped by whoever held the louder voice or the longer gun, and when his parents died within the same winter, his mother from a fever that no one rode fast enough to cure, his father from a fall no neighbor saw, Jonah learned what it meant to be unclaimed, how silence could be louder than grief, how a boy could vanish into work crews and cattle drives and come back years later with a different walk and a harder look, and it was during one of those drifting years that he met Eliza Marrow, though no song ever spoke her name alongside his, and no tale remembered the way she laughed with her whole face or how she believed, truly believed, that people were more than the worst things done to them, and Jonah had loved her in the careful way a man loves when he fears losing something precious, keeping his distance even as he lingered, helping her family mend fences, walking her home at dusk, never saying what his eyes said because he thought time would be patient with him. But time in the West was never kind to those who waited. It was the land dispute that broke everything open, when a powerful cattle syndicate laid claim to the Marrow homestead with papers that looked clean and lawful but smelled of inked lies, and Jonah remembered standing beside Eliza's father as the men came riding in, not shouting, not threatening, just certain, and certainty was its own kind of violence, because it left no room to argue, only to lose, and when Eliza's father refused to leave, when he stood on ground that held his whole life and said quietly that some things could not be bought, Jonah felt the world tip, because the next moments moved too fast and too slow all at once, and though the stories later would speak of gunfire and blood, Jonah's memory clung instead to Eliza's cry, to the way her voice tore through him sharper than any bullet, and he would carry that sound with him into every bad choice that followed. The official story said Jonah Hale killed a man that day and fled, becoming Jonah Crow as if the name itself could hide him, but the truth, the one he had never told, was that he did not pull the trigger. That fear and chaos had tangled together until no one could say whose hand ended that standoff, and yet Jonah ran anyway, because guilt did not wait for proof, and because Eliza's eyes, wide with shock and hurt, had followed him as he mounted his horse, and he could not bear to hear his own name spoken by her in that moment, could not stand still while the life he wanted burned down behind him, so he rode, and riding became running, and running hardened into habit, and the West rewarded hardness with survival, pushing him into robberies that were never cruel but never clean, into nights where he slept with one eye open and told himself he was already lost, and with every passing year the legend grew taller and darker, while the truth shrank, folding itself tighter inside him like a letter never sent, and Jonah told himself that Eliza would be better forgetting him, that the man he had become had no place near the woman she was meant to be, but he listened for news of her all the same, catching pieces from passing mouths, learning she had stayed, that she had rebuilt something smaller but steadier, that she spoke little of the past, and knowing this both steadied and wounded him, because it meant life went on without him, as it should, and yet there were nights by the fire when he imagined riding back, imagined standing at the edge of her land and saying everything he had swallowed, imagined her believing him, forgiving him, but the dawn always came and with it another reason not to turn around, now, sitting beneath the gallows with the rope above creaking softly, Jonah understood that the West would remember him as it pleased, that men would keep telling the simple version where he was only what he did after that day, and maybe that was fair, but what he could not accept was leaving Eliza's name tangled in a lie, leaving her memory marked by a moment that had never been what it seemed, and so, in the quiet hours before morning, Jonah began to shape his confession as carefully as he once shaped his distance, planning each word like a step across uncertain ground, deciding that when the sheriff returned, when anyone returned, he would speak not to save himself, because the law had already chosen its ending, but to set something right in the only way left to him. And as the wind sighed through the gallows and the lantern flickered, Jonah Crow, outlaw of the Wild West, finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of who he had been, who he had loved, and who he might have been if fear had not outrun hope, knowing that sunrise would take his breath, but hoping, quietly, that truth might travel farther than his shadow ever did. Beneath the wide and merciless sky of Red Mesa, where the desert stretched like an endless confession and the sun burned secrets into the sand, the widow arrived without announcement, riding a dust-worn horse at a pace too calm for someone who carried a name spoken only in lowered voices, and the townsfolk paused in their daily motions as if the air itself had tightened, because everyone in Red Mesa knew the stories of Mara Ellison, even if no one could say where they began or ended, how she had loved 3 men, all outlaws of different shades, and how each had met a violent end far from a warm bed or a forgiving hand, leaving behind nothing but rumors, shallow graves, and a woman who never cried in public. And so when she dismounted near the edge of town and claimed the small, abandoned house that leaned against the desert wind, the men watched from porches and saloons with a mix of fear and fascination, telling themselves that fate followed her like a shadow and that it was wiser to keep distance from a woman the West itself seemed to mark. Yet Mara moved through Red Mesa with quiet grace, her black dress simple and faded, her eyes steady and thoughtful, as if she had already seen the worst the world could offer and found no reason to flinch. And if there was sorrow in her, it was the kind that settled deep and spoke softly, revealing itself only in the way she paused at sunset or lingered near the sound of distant hoofbeats, because Mara did not believe she was cursed, not truly, but she did believe that love in the West came with a cost, and that she had paid it in full more than once. She had loved Thomas Ellison first, her husband, a rancher who believed land could be tamed with patience, and she had buried him after a dispute turned cruel, learning then how quickly a future could be reduced to a memory. And later she had loved men whose lives were already half shadowed by the choices they made, loving them not for their violence but for the tenderness they hid from the world, and when they died, she carried their stories with her, refusing to let them be reduced to wanted posters and careless talk. And it was this quiet loyalty, this refusal to forget, that made Red Mesa uneasy, because the town preferred its stories simple and its widows distant. Days passed under the burning sun, and Mara settled into a rhythm of solitude, repairing the house with careful hands, drawing water each morning, nodding politely but never lingering when spoken to, until one evening, when the sky bled orange and gold and the desert wind carried a sound that did not belong, a rough, broken breath followed by the dull weight of a body meeting earth, and Mara found him collapsed near her door, a gunslinger by the look of him, dust-covered, wounded but still breathing, his revolver loose in his hand as if he had fallen mid-thought. And for a long moment she simply stood there, knowing exactly what the town would say if she took him in, knowing the whispers would sharpen into certainty. Yet she also knew what it meant to leave a man to die under an open sky, and so she knelt, her movements practiced and calm, dragging him inside with more strength than her slight frame suggested, closing the door against the watching desert. And as she cleaned his wound and cooled his fever through the long night, she did not ask his name, because names carried weight, and she had learned not to lift them until necessary. When he woke, days later, the man looked at her as if he were seeing water after crossing miles of nothing, his voice rough when he finally spoke, calling her Mutt first, then Mara when she told him her name, and he said his was Caleb Rourke, a name she recognized from half-finished stories and warnings passed between camps, a gunslinger not known for cruelty but followed by trouble all the same, and something in his eyes told her he knew exactly whose house he lay in, that he had heard the same stories, and yet there was no fear there. Only a quiet curiosity and something softer he tried not to show. The town noticed the light in Mara's window at night and the way smoke rose from her chimney again, and the whispers returned, layered now with certainty, because a man had crossed her threshold and lived, at least for the moment. And as Caleb healed, moving slowly through the house like someone afraid to break a fragile thing, he and Mara spoke in careful pieces, about the weather, about Red Mesa's harsh beauty, about loss, without naming its sharpest edges, and the attraction that grew between them was not sudden or reckless but slow and hesitant, built from shared silences and the understanding that neither of them was untouched by the West's cruelty. And Mara felt the familiar pull of longing mixed with fear, wondering if love was something she was allowed to reach for again or merely something she was meant to remember, while Caleb, watching her move through lamplight with quiet purpose, felt a peace he had not known in years and feared it all the more because of that, because peace in the West was often temporary and always costly. When he was strong enough to walk outside, They stood together beneath the open sky, the desert stretching endlessly before them, and for a moment the world felt suspended, as if fate itself were holding its breath. But Red Mesa was not a place that let stories unfold gently, and soon the past came riding in on familiar faces and old debts, men who recognized Caleb and did not care whose door he had fallen at, and Mara saw the truth in their eyes before a single word was spoken, saw how easily the fragile calm could shatter, and though she said nothing, Caleb understood, understanding written in the tension of his shoulders and the way his hand hovered near his side without touching his gun, because he did not want violence to stain the small, precious peace they had found. Yet the West did not always offer choice, and as the sun dipped low once more and shadows stretched long across Red Mesa, the town waited. The widow stood at her door, and fate, patient and unkind, began weaving its next thread, leaving Mara to wonder whether loving again meant accepting loss before it arrived, and leaving Caleb to question whether staying might cost her more than leaving ever could. Deadwood Crossing had long forgotten the sound of a badge knocking against a man's chest, and when the rider appeared at the edge of town just as the day leaned toward dusk, most folks barely looked up, assuming he was just another weary soul passing through, because the West was full of men who arrived broken and left unchanged. Yet there was something about this one that unsettled the air itself, something in the way his horse moved slow and careful, something in the way his shoulders carried a weight heavier than saddle or gun, and when he finally dismounted near the dry well at the center of Deadwood Crossing, the truth revealed itself quietly, almost shyly, in the dull glint of metal pinned beneath his dust-dark coat, a marshal's badge, scratched and worn, like it had survived more than its owner ever wanted to remember. His name was Samuel Cole, though few would ask and fewer still would care, because Deadwood Crossing was a town shaped by absence, by years without law or mercy, a place where storefronts leaned like tired men and the saloon served as courthouse, confessional, and warning all at once, and Samuel had not planned to stop there, not truly, but the horse had gone lame 2 miles back and the old injury in his leg, earned years earlier in a job gone wrong, had begun to throb with a deep, familiar ache that reminded him of why he had sworn never to wear the badge again, why he had folded it away after the night that still visited him in sleep, the night he failed to save a town not unlike this one, the night fear hesitated where courage should have stood firm, and people paid the price. Deadwood Crossing did not greet him with hope, only with suspicion, because hope had been bled out of the place by men who learned early that strength ruled where law did not, and those men noticed Samuel almost immediately, the way men who rule by fear always do, measuring him not by his limp or his tired eyes but by the quiet steadiness in his gaze, the kind that came from having seen worse and survived it poorly. And when word spread that a marshal had ridden in, broken or not, the town shifted, some with guarded relief, others with sharp resentment, because law meant change, and change was dangerous to those who benefited from the way things were. Samuel took a room above the general store, paid in coin he could not spare, and sat alone that first night listening to the wind move through cracked boards and loose signs, listening as memory crept in uninvited, reminding him of Deadwood Ridge, the town he once swore to protect, the town where he had been younger, prouder, convinced that doing the right thing would be enough, and how that belief had shattered when he hesitated at the wrong moment, choosing caution over conviction, and by the time he acted, it was already too late, leaving behind graves, ashes, and a badge that felt heavier than any chain. The next morning, Samuel stepped into the street and Deadwood Crossing felt him fully for the first time, because broken did not mean weak, and grit often lived longest in men who had already lost everything, and when trouble found him, as it always did, it came in the form of a beating meant to send a message, rough hands and mocking laughter in an alley that smelled of dust and old spills, and Samuel went down hard, his legs screaming, but he did not stay down, because he had learned that lesson the hard way. And when he rose, blooded but steady, and spoke with a voice that carried farther than shouting ever could, something shifted in the watching crowd, something old and half-forgotten stirring in their chests, the memory of a time when someone stood up not because it was easy but because it was necessary. From that day on, the town prepared, without quite admitting it, because Deadwood Crossing had enemies both within and riding toward it, a gang that claimed the crossing as theirs, men who thrived in the vacuum left by law's absence, and Samuel knew them well enough to recognize the signs, the quiet packing of families who could afford to leave, the sharpening of knives, the way conversations stopped when certain riders passed, and though every instinct in him urged retreat, urged him to ride on and leave this place to its fate as he once had, the badge felt heavier against his chest with every step, reminding him that running had never truly freed him from the past. He met the townsfolk one by one, not with speeches or promises but with listening, with small acts that mattered more than grand words, helping a shopkeeper recover stolen goods, standing between a frightened boy and a raised hand, showing by example that law was not about force but about presence, and slowly, cautiously, Deadwood Crossing began to remember what it felt like to be protected, even as fear grew alongside hope, because the gang would not ignore a challenge, especially not from a marshal who looked like he might fall apart if pushed too hard. At night, Samuel sat alone with his memories, the ghosts of Deadwood Ridge whispering that he would fail again, that courage delayed was courage denied, and he wrestled with those voices not by denying them but by accepting them, understanding now that heroism was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. And when the riders finally came, dust rising on the horizon, guns visible but not yet drawn, the town held its breath, because war had arrived whether they wanted it or not, and Samuel stood at the center of Deadwood Crossing, leg aching, hand steady, badge catching the sun, and for a moment he saw the past and present align, saw the boy he had been and the man he was now, and he knew that whatever happened next would not erase his failure, but it might finally give it meaning. He spoke to the gang leader not with threats but with truth, naming the cost of violence, naming the lives that would be lost on both sides, offering a choice that surprised even him, because he had learned too late once that force alone only deepened wounds, and the silence that followed was heavy and uncertain, stretched thin by pride and old grudges, until a single gunshot cracked the air, not from Samuel, not from the gang leader, but from fear itself, and the town erupted into chaos that felt both sudden and inevitable. Yet this time Samuel did not freeze, did not wait for the perfect moment that never came, moving instead with painful determination, placing himself where he was needed most, not fearless but resolved, and when the dust finally settled and the echoes faded, Deadwood Crossing still stood, scarred but breathing, because one broken marshal had chosen to face his ghosts instead of outrunning them, and as dawn broke over the crossing, lighting the town in soft, forgiving colors, Samuel Cole sat on the steps of the general store, exhausted and aching, unsure if he would stay or ride on, but certain of one thing at last, that the badge he never wanted to wear again had not been his burden alone, but his second chance, and that sometimes the last marshal a town ever sees is the one who needed redemption as much as the place he came to save, deep in the broken throat of Black Canyon, where the earth split open like an old wound and the sun rarely reached the bottom. The legend of the Devil's Gold had lived longer than most men dared remember. Whispered in campfire circles and half laughed away in saloons, because everyone in the West knew the story even if no one claimed to believe it, that somewhere in the canyon ran a hidden vein of gold so pure it glowed in moonlight, and that every soul who found it vanished or returned changed, hollow-eyed and restless, as if something had followed them back, and when Caleb Finch came upon the map, he did not believe the legend either, not at first, because desperation had a way of dulling superstition, and Caleb had been desperate for a long time. He was not a cruel man, nor a foolish one, just worn thin by years of dry claims, broken tools, and promises that never paid out, a widower with no land left and no future to imagine beyond the next day's hunger, and the map came to him by accident, tucked inside the false bottom of a trader's desk he purchased for almost nothing, its paper yellowed and brittle, its markings faint but deliberate, leading not to hope exactly but to possibility, and possibility was enough to make a man listen. The first whisper came that very night. As Caleb studied the map by lantern light, a sound like breath brushing his ear, too soft to be words yet heavy with meaning, and when he lifted his head, heart quickening, there was nothing there but the creak of the boards and the desert wind slipping through the cracks, and he told himself it was imagination, that loneliness had a voice of its own, but the whispers returned the next night, and the next, growing clearer, shaping themselves into promises spoken in tones that felt strangely familiar, reminding him of debts paid and futures secured, of a life where worry loosened its grip, and Caleb, who had spent years listening to the silence of empty ground, found himself listening back. He packed quietly before dawn and rode west, following the map across miles of sun-bleached nothing, and as the land grew harsher and the sky wider, the whispers grew steadier, no longer frightening but guiding, urging him onward when doubt crept in, soothing him when exhaustion weighed heavy. And though part of him wondered if he was chasing madness, another part, the part shaped by loss, felt certain that something waited in Black Canyon, something meant just for him. The canyon revealed itself slowly, a jagged scar cutting through the earth, its shadows cool and deep even under the noon sun, and as Caleb descended along a narrow trail, the air seemed to change, thickening with a strange stillness, the usual desert sounds falling away until even his horse's breathing sounded too loud. And it was there, at the canyon's heart, that he found the vein. exposed in the rock like a secret too long buried, gold running through stone in a way that seemed almost unnatural, bright and untouched, and Caleb fell to his knees, laughter breaking from him in disbelief, his hands trembling as he brushed the dust away, because the whispers had been right, because for the first time in years the future felt real again, but even as joy flooded him, unease crept in alongside it, because the canyon felt crowded now, though he stood alone, and the whispers shifted, no longer merely promising but instructing, urging him to take more, to dig deeper, to stay, and when he hesitated, the voices reminded him of what he had lost, of the wife he buried under a sky just as wide, of the years that slipped through his fingers like sand, and Caleb realized with a chill that the voices did not offer new desires, they fed on old ones, sharpening them until they cut. Days passed in a blur of digging and gathering, and though his body ached and his sleep grew restless, Caleb could not bring himself to leave, because each time he packed his supplies, the whispers rose in urgency, warning him that others would come, that the gold was his alone, that leaving meant losing everything again, and he began to notice changes in himself, small at first, the way his thoughts circled endlessly back to the gold, the way the canyon wall seemed to lean closer each night, the way his reflection in the water looked unfamiliar, eyes too bright, smile too thin, and when he finally loaded his horse with as much as it could carry and started out of the canyon, relief washing over him, the whispers followed, drifting behind him like a shadow that stretched too long, reminding him that bargains once made were not easily broken. The journey back across the desert felt longer, heavier, and though the sun still rose and set as it always had, Caleb felt disconnected from the rhythm of the world, as if he were walking slightly out of step with time itself, and when he reached the outskirts of a small settlement, he noticed the way people looked at him, not with envy, but with unease, as though they sensed something clinging to him unseen, and at night, alone in his room, the whispers returned stronger than ever, no longer gentle but demanding, telling him the gold was not enough, that it was only the beginning, that more waited in the canyon, and that he owed something in return for what he had taken. Caleb tried to ignore them, tried to focus on practical matters, selling the gold, securing a future, but every step toward normalcy felt wrong, like wearing clothes that did not fit, and when a prospector he met spoke excitedly of Black Canyon, of rumors stirring again, fear flared sharp and sudden in Caleb's chest, because the thought of others finding the vein filled him with a possessive dread he did not recognize as his own. The whispers praised that fear, fed it, told him it meant the gold had chosen him, that guarding it was his purpose now, and one night, unable to bear the pull any longer, Caleb found himself saddling his horse and riding back toward the canyon without fully deciding to do so, as if his body moved on instructions his mind had not agreed to, and the closer he drew, the lighter he felt, the desert opening before him like a familiar path, welcoming him home. Dawn found him once more at the canyon's edge, staring down into its depths, and in that moment of stillness, something shifted, because for the first time since finding the map, Caleb felt the weight of what he was becoming, felt the thinness of his own will beneath the voices pressing in, and he remembered his wife's voice, not as a whisper, but as it had been in life, steady and warm, reminding him of who he had been before hunger and grief narrowed his world, and that memory cut through the chorus like light through dust, giving him a clarity that hurt but held. And Caleb understood then that the gold had never been cursed because of what it was, but because of what it awakened, because it listened too closely to desire and answered without mercy. The whispers raged at this realization, turning sharp and cruel, promising ruin if he turned away, but for the first time, Caleb answered them, not aloud but with action, casting the map into the canyon's depths, watching it flutter down like a final confession, and the voices faltered, their certainty cracking as if the canyon itself were surprised. And when Caleb rode away this time, he did not look back, riding until the whispers faded into memory and the desert sounds returned, ordinary and grounding. And though he arrived in town poorer than he might have been and uncertain of what came next, there was a lightness in him he had not felt in years, because he had learned that some riches demanded too much, and some prices, once paid, could never be refunded. The legend of the Devil's Gold did not end with Caleb Finch, legends rarely did, but somewhere deep in Black Canyon, the vein lay hidden once more, waiting, patient as the earth itself, and the whispers, diminished but not gone, lingered for the next desperate soul to listen, while Caleb walked on under the open sky, carrying nothing but his tools, his memories, and the quiet knowledge that the West tested men not by what it offered them, but by what it asked them to give in return.